Good afternoon, everybody. We'll get started. This is an experience, but we weren't able to do this last year. So here we are in person, live streaming and on Zoom. So we combined all the technologies. This is the new normal. So welcome, everybody. And I want to thank Dr. Kia and the Southwest Central Asian Studies Program for having to sponsor this event, along with the Montana World Affairs Council, Chris Heaslip. I'm going to introduce Chris, let him come up and say a few brief words, and then I will give a brief overview of an area that I think is going to be of critical importance going forward, and then turn it over to Dr. Kia, who will answer and give you insight that you will find in few places. So welcome, everybody, and Chris, please join us.
Doesn't matter, it's up to you.
I would be grateful to take
Greetings, everybody. I'm Chris Hislop. I'm the Executive Director at the Montana World Affairs Council. Let me first start by thanking Dr. Kia and the University of Montana for hosting this event and allowing the Montana World Affairs Council to come on as co-host, and my colleague, Bob Seidenschwarz, who's the President Emeritus at our organization. These two gentlemen here have been longtime supporters of our work, and our work is about engaging communities and students in international issues across Montana. We do in-person events, we do virtual events, we do some things here in Missoula, and I'm very happy to say that this is the first time we've done an in-person event since March 2020. So it feels good to be back out here. It feels great to be here at the University of Montana. Always a great host and a great partner for everything that we do. Now, I was talking to Dr. Kia earlier, and I'll just mention that I spent quite some time in Afghanistan, but this is coming on nearly 20 years ago during the Taliban times, and then shortly thereafter. So I was particularly grateful to these gentlemen up here who agreed to have this talk today to give you more insight into not only the historical aspects, but kind of what's going on now, how can we understand it, and what does it mean for us? And I'll just say finally that that's really the goal of the Montana World Affairs Council. What we're trying to do in schools and communities across Montana is just that. We want to be able to answer the three basic questions. What, so what, and now what? What is going on is the what. What are the facts? Who are the players? So what means, what does that matter for us? Why should Montanans care about this? Why should Americans care about this? And finally, now what? Knowing these things, what can and should you as an individual or as our community do about it? So if you're interested in more about the Montana World Affairs Council, please see me. I've left a few of my business cards here at the edge of the table. If you're not already involved, please do so. And with that, I want to hand it over now to Bob Seidenschwarz.
Thank you, Chris.
All right, I am given the monumental task of having about 10 minutes to give you an overview that really should probably take several hours, so I will do my best here. So I wanted to start with Afghanistan, the untold story. Or maybe the story's over if I can't get the clicker to work. All right, so I'm sure many of you know where Afghanistan is on the map, but just for purpose of reference, landlocked country, you can see who's it's surrounded by. Dr. Kia will give more insight as to some of the significance of some of these players that surround Afghanistan. Just keep in mind, landlocked country, and it's a key component of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which will go through that area. What did I do with mine? I wanted to provide you just with a little bit of oversight because I'm going to splash not just a bucket, but an entire ocean of water on the responsibility and the challenge that this new government, the Taliban, is going to have to be taking. What they are facing, and I want you to keep in mind when you think about this brief presentation, we'll have questions later, of course, is think about the next several weeks, next several months, and the next several years. I had the privilege of interviewing Will Todman earlier today, and the discussion was on the Middle East and infrastructure issues, something that will become more significant as the years go by, water issues, electricity, the availability or lack of, infrastructure, which is critical to economic development, and this is where it's going to be a monumental challenge to the Taliban. So when you look at Afghanistan as it stands right now, these are its top exports, medicinal plants, which includes legal opiates. Afghanistan also exports about 90% of the illegal opiates, which right now is a problem for the EU because it's being flooded with significant amount of opiates that are coming in at depressed prices, leading to even greater usage. So other carpets and rugs, dried fruit. So you can see this is not an industrialized country. That's all I need to say for at the moment. As far as top trading partners, you've got Pakistan, India, Russia, and others comes under the category of Turkey, the UAE, and China. China will become a much larger partner and a much larger part of the equation as we speak right now. And here's where it gets very interesting. If you look at their untapped natural resources, copper, gold, oil, natural gas, uranium, coal, lithium, and gemstones. This is the great grab of resources. This is not a country that has developed infrastructure so that the ability to mine and get access to these resources is readily available. It's going to take tremendous capital. Literally think of a mountainside filled with a particular resource. From the very origin of discovering that resource, you're going to have to build rail systems, roadways. You're going to have power, electricity going to that site. You're going to have water. You're going to have a trained workforce. This is something that in many parts of Afghanistan, literally you're going to be starting from scratch. And ask yourself this question: is this going to be a government that has the institutional skill sets and the credibility and integrity to attract the capital that's going to be necessary for the development of these resources? China is going to be stepping into a massive void of opportunity and problems. And it'll be interesting to see over the next several years and decades if this turns out to be the payday that they hope it will. It may just be the next quagmire economically for China and those that wish to invest in this country if you don't have accountability and stable government that makes it worthy of businesses risking their capital to come into a country as it stands right now. And I'm not saying that maybe 5, 10, or 15 years from now, the environment may be different. But at the moment, if you're thinking about investing capital, ask yourself the fundamental question: can it be taken? What's the risk? What's the return on that investment? And of course, what is the human capital available, which is a significant part of the issue also. Because who do you have as the skilled individuals and entities that are able to do the work that's going to be required? My apologies for getting through this rather quickly, but I'll give you a taste of what we're going to be looking at here. This is the Belt and Road Initiative that is a significant part of China's natural resource and economic development. It's kind of the, think about the Marco Polo over the land from Europe into China going back centuries. This is that new initiative. That in itself is a grand idea, but like everything big and bold, is fraught with problems and issues that you do not anticipate. And remember that whatever you think looks good on paper, the reality of doing that in person, working with an entity and a government to get something done, usually has a whole different look and feel, and the outcome is sometimes very different than what you expect. This is where, for me, this is where it gets real interesting. I just want to break this down. 63% of the Afghan population is under 25 years of age. Now think about that for a minute. If you have grown up principally exposed to American military and American culture, and there are parts of the country that have seen progress, women's rights, education, some infrastructure, how do you now transition to a potentially radically different economic and cultural environment? This population, I'm not going out on a limb when I tell you, is going to be probably the greatest challenge that this government will have, because they are not going to settle for going backwards. They are not going to accept that what they have already experienced and what is now in their DNA is going to be comfortable settling for anything less than the opportunities that they see around them, not only in their own country, but in the region and the rest of the world. That's an issue not just in Afghanistan, but in the Middle East in general. These are very young populations that are connected technologically, internally and externally. So just keep that in mind as you see the story unfolding. On your right or left, depending on where you're sitting, literacy. This is another issue in terms of the literacy rate in Afghanistan is considerably less than the countries that you see above it. Now, How do you develop an economic model? How do you develop opportunity from the teaching to the implementation if you do not have a country that has a high literacy rate? So if you leave out a significant part of that population, i.e. women, you're also cutting yourself off at the knees in terms of economic opportunity for not just the women, but for the rest of the country as well. It's like investing in something and saying, well, I'll only take half of it, and I don't want the full potential, I'll just take half. So it's going to be a massive challenge to see how they deal with that issue, because human capital becomes critical to economic development. I'm not expecting you to understand this graph, so I brought some notes. It's difficult to see, difficult to read. But let me give you the interpretation. On this slide, each web point is a global percentile relative to other nations. Afghanistan is in the global 80 percentile for unemployment. Think about that for a minute, 80% unemployment. How is this new government going to respond to that? It won't be long before what you already see happening in that country grows ever larger if jobs and the potential for a future other than what exists right now is not being given that opportunity. In other words, they're at the bottom 20% of all nations in terms of unemployment rate. The graph shows Afghanistan's global rank in each of these categories. Starting at the top, Afghan exports is in the 70 percentile of all countries globally. So it's not a big export, it's stating the obvious. So where's the revenue going to come from? If the resources aren't developed, they don't have oil or gas, like many other Middle East countries have as a revenue generating source, where will that revenue come from that's required to run a country and develop the infrastructure necessary? Moving clockwise, Afghan's foreign direct investment is below the 20 percentile of all countries. Because of its geopolitical instability and poor living conditions, the country has poor foreign relations and a lack of global investor confidence. IMF, World Bank, private investment, NGOs, are they willing to risk their capital? So it's a duality here. I offer you an opportunity by providing capital. In return, this is what I expect in terms of behavior, in terms of opening up rights, a number of different issues that we can make conditional upon capital being invested and providing expertise. If you don't perform, that capital can be taken away. Then you have the issue of corruption. So it's going to be a dog's breakfast of what and how we can use leverage here to encourage certain types of behavior that are necessary for economic development. But on the private sector side, China's willing to make a big bet. My guess is many other countries or private businesses are not. They need to see conditions change. They need to see legal systems that protect your economic and private sector rights as well as public. They need to see educational opportunities because of the workforce requirements. So what I'm starting to do is paint a picture of a massive challenge in front of this new government in a country that is not prepared. Economic growth rate, 60%, that looks a little out of sync because they're starting from such a low base. Inflation is about 50 percentile due to lack of competent central bank, low confidence in its currency. Your currency and your banking system is critical for capital investment and for those who need loans to start businesses. Where will this come from? Quick little story, when the Ukraine gains its independence. I'm right at 10. All right, I'm going to cut this off here. Just some things that kind of reinforce what I'm saying. And impact of the brain drain. The last thing I'm going to say is, with people leaving the country, your human capital is your most critical resource. When you lose the expertise that are the people that can run your government, your bureaucrats, your engineers, the people that keep the electricity on, when they're not there, ask yourself the simple question: who will replace them? And what type of expertise and experience and skill sets does this new government bring to the table? Thank you very much. I'm sorry to be so brief, but appreciate the opportunity.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here. I know many of you are on Zoom, and it's different circumstances, different environment, as Chris mentioned, but it's still wonderful to have all of you with us. I first want to thank the co-director of the Central Southwest Asian Studies Center, Dr. Ardi Kia, who has done a great deal, not only for the university and the center, but also played an important part in organizing this. I also want to thank all our staff people here for doing a great job. For sign language, thank you very much. Greg and others, thank you so much for being here as always. And of course, Bob, thank you very much for that introduction. And Chris, it's wonderful having you and Montana World Affairs Council with us. As I was preparing these remarks for this talk, I wanted to sort of wonder how to start. And somehow, some way, I was reminded of the story that was very prevalent in Afghanistan for a long time. And it's the story of an American scholar who arrives one late afternoon in Kabul, Afghanistan. And he goes to a hotel from the airport. He sleeps, very comfortable hotel. He gets up the next day. The person he has talked to and he has hired as his assistant is waiting for him in the lobby in the hotel. And as soon as they meet, they exchange greetings. He hands the Afghan assistant a list. And the Afghan assistant looks, it's 150 names of very prominent Afghan politicians, Afghan journalists, writers, poets, so on and so forth. And he says, what do you want me to do? He said, I want you to set up a meeting with these people. And the Afghan fellow says, of course, I will start working on it, and in the next several weeks, we will be happy to have meetings scheduled for you. And the American fellow responds by saying, no, I gave you this list, so you set up meetings right now, today, this morning, noon, this afternoon, and this evening. He says, that's nearly impossible. 150 people, how can I set up meetings where, and tell me, what are you doing here in Afghanistan anyway? He says, I'm writing a book. And he says, that's wonderful. And when did you arrive in Afghanistan? And he says, I arrived yesterday. So when are you leaving? He says, I'm leaving tomorrow. And he said, what is the title of your book? He says, Afghanistan yesterday, today, and tomorrow. You know, this tells you a little bit about the lack of depth. And I noticed as soon as the Afghan crisis began to unfold, you had all these sort of talking heads on TV stations who have no idea what Afghanistan is, what kind of country, what kind of complex civilization and culture it is, giving all these opinions. Oh, it's a tribal society. Well, it's basically tribes. No, it's a revolt against globalization. It's revolt against capitalism, so on and so on. I always watch these kind of one-sentence show, you know, one-sentence burst, and I'm wondering, how much did you really think or study this? You know, this is about 4,000 or 5,000 years of history, civilization, and so on and so forth. How dare can anybody go and talk about England, France, Spain, Italy, Germany? Say, it's this, right? It is this revolt against something, right? You will be nailed and somewhere, and you will be fired immediately. You have to know the language, you have to know the culture, you have to know the history, you have to know the various layers of the society before you have an opinion. But of course it's Orient, right? It's the East. And East is a monolith. It's a monolith of deserts and camels and Arabs running around with turbans. And of course, when you have that monolith in your heads, you always come up with some easy, simple solution. So the task today is to avoid easy solutions and easy analysis and to confuse you as much as possible. I bet you I will do that. And overwhelm you with facts, overwhelm you with realities, and hope that some of us at least will go and pick up a book and read and study Afghanistan as a society and as a very complex culture. But let me start with a very, very disturbing update. This is the government of Afghanistan as we stand. And it was declared yesterday. And as you see these individuals, you realize that all of them were former prisoners in Gitmo. They were wanted terrorists. As I checked, the latest is that they are all wanted terrorists still on the FBI list. And of course, the most amazing thing is that the leader, Akhund or Akhundzadeh, who is now Taliban's supreme leader, is number 1 or number 2 on FBI's wanted list. And it says something to you. They were released, of course, during the Obama administration as a way for starting the negotiations with Taliban. And we were told, I never forget, that they will all go to Qatar, of all places in the Persian Gulf. They will be housed in a hotel, and they will be playing golf. And they will shave their beard, and they will become moderate individuals, and so on and so forth. And look where they are today. They are actually forming a government in Kabul. And guess what? On Saturday, they will be celebrating the anniversary of 9/11 with a victory parade, because Taliban indeed has been victorious. Let us not kid ourselves. This was a victory that Taliban scored, of course, with very heavy hand from Pakistan, several Arab countries, and we will go over this in order for us to understand in depth where we are coming from. So to start with, and Bob mentioned something very foundational, Afghanistan is a landlocked country. And the shape, this is the ABC of understanding this. A lot of these countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, those countries we lazily called Istans, the 5 Istans. We don't even want to mention their names. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. These are all creations of colonial powers. These borders are all fake. They are all fictional. And Afghanistan, if you look at it very clearly, it was created by the British in 1850s, more accurately in 1857, when Afghanistan and Iran were separated in accordance to the Treaty of Paris. If you want to define Afghanistan, Afghanistan is the eastern wing of the Persian Empire, really, whereas Iran is the western wing of that Persian Empire. That is, they were one whole, political whole, cultural whole. Afghanistan's official language was from immemorial days Persian, which is the same language as in Iran. And this separation meant that the British wanted to create a buffer state, a rugged, mountainous buffer state between themselves in India. There was no Pakistan in 1850s. Pakistan was created in August of 1947 with the collapse of the British Empire in India. And of course, India therefore came all the way to the southern borders of Afghanistan, the British in India to the south, and the Russians to the north. Russians had just occupied Central Asia. These countries to the north did not exist at the time. They came into existence during Soviet Union. This buffer state was supposed to work as the graveyard of a Russian army if they ever tried to invade India, British-held India. So these borders are very artificial at best. Now, we hear a lot about the fact that Afghanistan is all tribal, this, that, and they are another nation, and so on and so forth. In terms of languages, Afghanistan is actually divided into two sort of very distinct blocks. From Kabul to the north, northeast, northwest is Persian. It's called Dari in some sources. It calls Tajik All these words, Dari, Tajik, Farsi, they're all referring to the same language, Persian. And why is this so important? Because the British preferred using Dari, so they don't use Farsi. The Russians preferred using Tajik in order to create these fictional distinctions that the Persian speakers in Central Asia were, of course, not speaking exactly Farsi of Iran, and the British also did the same thing, that the Persian speakers in Afghanistan are speaking a different language from Farsi of Iran. This is all Farsi. This is all Persian. This is all Tajik. This is all Dari. It's the same language. And the South. The South is Pashto. Pashto is an Iranic language. It's an Indo-European language. It's not Semitic. It's not related to Arabic or Hebrew. It is not Turkic. It is not connected to Turkish, Uzbek, Turkmen. It is actually an Iranic language of Eastern kind. So Pashto and Persian are actually sister languages, but they are spoken Pashto in the south and Persian or Tajik or Dari in the north, with pockets in orange and beige of Uzbek and Turkmen, which are Turkic languages in the north. It is a country of diverse ethnic and linguistic groups. And I will go over them very quickly in order for us to appreciate the diversity. Let us start with roughly 30 to 35% of the population, which consider themselves Persian first language, mother language, Persian speakers. And you realize that these are people who have been there. They're the most ancient layer in Afghanistan. And of course, they still remain very much opposed to Taliban, because Taliban are based in the south among the Pashtun speakers in the brown area, and they are considered to be enemies by the Tajiks in the north. And this Tajik population is sophisticated, highly educated. They're either urban or rural, but they are not part of Taliban, and they're not tribal. There are no tribes in the north, basically. Afghanistan is a non-tribal society. And the overwhelming majority of terrorist attacks against the United States in Afghanistan, and even today with Taliban, comes from southern part of Afghanistan. And that is from the Pashtun-speaking or Pashto-speaking areas in the south. The Pashtuns, who are the cousins of Tajiks in terms of their language, live on the two sides of the border. In Afghanistan, they are, now the numbers, if I throw a number here, I will be attacked, for just throwing a number. But they were given numbers of 11 million in the beginning of the century. Perhaps they are up to 15 or 20 million. But the majority of the Pashtuns, in fact, do not live in southern Afghanistan. They live inside Pakistan. And one of the reasons Pakistan is so nervous about Afghanistan is, what if the Pashtuns in Afghanistan and Pashtuns in Pakistan join together and create a new country called Pashtunistan? So all this military intervention in the internal affairs of Afghanistan is to prevent the creation of a unified Pashtunistan between the Pashtuns in Pakistan and Afghanistan. The concentration of the Pashtuns in southern Afghanistan is in the brown area, as you see. They are also an Indo-European people. They are an ancient people also, and they are part of the Eastern Iranic people, but they do not speak Persian, of course. There are, and here it is, there are tribes among the Pashtuns. Here, Afghanistan does become tribal. There are roughly 60 tribes among the Pashtuns, and it's a messy politics because these tribes fight over resources, over grazing land, over political power. But the most important tribal groups are Durrani and, of course, the Ghalzai. And it's very important to understand that the government of Afghanistan has always been dominated by the Pashtun because they have been more warrior-like, more armed, more tribal. And the Duranis basically provided Afghanistan with the kings of Afghanistan in the past. The Taliban comes from the Karzai. This is the fight between the two tribal groups, basically, in the Pashtun area. And that's one of the things that we have to understand. The Pashtuns are generally unified over language, of course, a Sunni form of Islam, and a common social code, which is called Pashtunwali. It's a conduct code of remaining faithful to your guests, remaining faithful to your family, and maintaining your promises. Based on Pashtunwali promise to Osama bin Laden, Taliban refused to hand him to US authorities after 9/11. These are things that are important to understand for cultural reasons. The third largest group, and I'm moving, of course, very fast on this, are the Hizaras. Hizaras are a very interesting people. They are actually living in central Afghanistan. They are not tribal again. They are remnants of Mongol invaders from Central Asia. They are a Turkic Mongolian people. They came to Afghanistan with Genghis Khan's armies. They settled there. They have long forgotten their Mongolian tongue. They have become Persianized. They speak Persian, only Persian. But interestingly enough, under the influence of Iran and the Persian Empire, they have become Shia Muslims. They actually share the same Islam, or form of Islam, with the majority of the Iranians. And they constitute roughly 10% of the Afghan population. They have been subjected inside Afghanistan and outside to a systematic form of racism because they are considered to be outsiders, because they have features of Mongols, Central Asians, and they are not correctly Indo-European. And for that reason, they have been targeted under attacks and under a lot of persecution. Aside from the fact that their religion, Shia Islam, has added to the sense of persecution, they are a minority in Afghanistan where Sunni Islam or Orthodox Islam is the majority religion. The remaining parts, and I'm not going to go over all of them, are Turkic people, the Uzbeks and Turkmen of Afghanistan. They are roughly about 2% of the population. They are mostly in the north. They have sort of adopted also Tajik and Persian as their language, but they also speak a form of Turkic language, Uzbek, and in the case of Turkmen, they are connected to Central Asia, to Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, to the north. And of course, they remain a very important force because Uzbeks are known in Afghanistan to be the finest fighters against Taliban especially. And in shaping the Northern Alliance today, the Uzbeks have joined the Tajik Persians in forming a union against Taliban in the south. This is how the country is becoming divided. To bring our discussion of this to a bit of a conclusion, we have to speak about this fascinating people, the Nuristanis. Nuristan simply means the land of Nur, the land of light. And Nuristani is the people who are from the land of light. You see the features are extremely European, right? And nobody knows exactly where they come. There are these mythologies. They are the remnants of the armies of Alexander when he came here, which is completely nonsense. In fact, Nuristanis who live in the mountains clearly show what the original Indo-Europeans looked when they settled, and they remained isolated. For a long time, they remained non-Muslims. They were not followers of Islam. They were the last people, probably in the world, who were forcibly converted to Islam by means of arms. The Afghan government sent arms. They were in fact referred to as kafirs, which simply means idol worshippers, because they've worshipped a form of ancient Hinduism mixed with pre-Islamic Iranian traditions. And of course, after the Kafirs were conquered, instead of calling them Kafiristan, the land of idol worshippers, they were changed to Nuristan, the land of light. The light of Islam had shone upon them, and that's why they changed their names. So Nuristan is about 300,000 today to 500,000, are a very, very, very interesting people. There are several languages spoken. Nuristan is in northeastern Afghanistan, and they remain a very uniquely, community in Afghanistan. They still live in their mountain villages. These are beautiful sort of settings in which they live, and they proudly want to keep their traditions. But of course, they're under constant pressure, and it would be interesting to see how Taliban will handle Nuristan and other parts of non-Pashtun Afghanistan. I do not foresee a peaceful coexistence between religious fundamentalists in the south with people who carry ancient traditions of their own. Afghanistan, coming to its political history, Afghanistan was ruled by a monarchy until 1973. The last Shah, the last king. Iran and Afghanistan were the only two countries where the ruler was called the Shah. The Shah is basically the title for the fatherly king. And this was the sort of the title for the king. Muhammad Zahir Shah ruled for nearly 40 years. By all measures today, Afghans would agree that he was a very modest and relatively peaceful person. He tried to have a constitutional monarchy in Afghanistan. What the Afghans now refer to him is Babay Millat, the father of the nation, because of the peace he brought, because of a semi-democratic system he brought. And believe it or not, this was Afghanistan in 1960s and 70s under Zahir Shah. This is very interesting. It wasn't the kind of modernization, fast, rapid modernization, which took place in Iran under Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah. It wasn't the kind of fast modernization that took place in Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. It was a very slow modernization, but women were allowed to wear whatever they wished. Kabul University was a center of intellectual gatherings. This was a growing, fledgling, secular modern society which had instruments of modernity and modernization. It wasn't fast, it wasn't quick, it wasn't radical, but it was creating a middle class in Afghanistan. And of course, when you look at these and compare it with the burqas of Taliban, you realize this is Ariana Airlines and its hostesses. What happened to Afghanistan? It's quite astonishing. These are tourists arriving in Kandahar in southern Afghanistan, today the capital of Taliban in the south. And growing up next door in Iran, you could not fail to see a huge number of European tourists traveling through Turkey, traveling through Iran, going from Europe to Turkey to Iran, and going for camping to various places in Afghanistan. Afghanistan has a majestic geography. Band Amir, the national park, it's really the envy of the world. It's the Glacier National Park of South Asia or the Middle East. It's a beautiful place. And, rowing, camping, hiking, so on and so forth. And of course, Europeans came in droves. And of course, this is not for the young people to get attracted and say, Kia. But there was also the rumor that Afghanistan had a very good hashish and opium. So, it's 60s and early 70s, you go a long way, you visit the Orient, you visit the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, you visit the Persians in Iran, then you go to, you have a little bit of groovy time in a national park in Afghanistan. This was sort of the image of Afghanistan. And of course, it was going in a direction that nobody could have imagined. Now, what is very essential for us to understand as we move to modern day Afghanistan and Taliban is that the brilliance of Zahir Shah was maintaining a non-aligned status. He was not ally of anyone. He was not ally of United States. He was not ally of Soviet Union. He maintained a neutral stand, basically. He visited United States. You see him here with JFK. And of course, the relationship with the United States was very warm, very close. But having been brought up in a French lycée, he was a lover of French literature, French poetry, French drama. Here with President Charles de Gaulle of France, he loved France, and he spoke it fluently, and he was a highly, highly cultured man. And he allowed foreign schools, American schools, French schools, British schools, to sort of open and expand their activities. He was very well respected in various courts of Europe. Here is, of course, with Queen Elizabeth. But at the same time, he maintained a very close relationship with the Soviet Union. He only complained about the amount of vodka he had to consume every time he met with, in this case, Nikita Khrushchev. And of course, before that, with Kosygin. Of course, he knew that Afghanistan has a border with Soviet Union. He knew the reality, that Soviet Union is a reality. But at the same time, he was looking at opportunities. So, for example, when the communist movement seized power in China, and after Mao Zedong established himself, Afghanistan established a very close tie with China. And in fact, trade and commerce that Bob referred to was established back in 1950s, 1960s. The problem area was always Pakistan. Pakistan to the south was very worried about the Pashtuns in Pakistan, joining the Pashtuns in Afghanistan, creating a unified Pashtunistan. Here, I believe it is General or President Ayub Khan, who happens to be, by the way, himself a Pashtun originally. But of course, he represented Pakistan. And the pressure on Zahir Shah was, calm down on Pashtun nationalism, because Pakistan is very worried about it. Iran was a very close ally for the reason that Afghans needed to export their goods by land. Soviet Union was closed, China was closed, Pakistan was not friendly. So how did you do it? Is by West, through the West, and that West was the Shah of Iran, and of course the relationship was very close. There was another option. The option was through India also. And India was also very close ally of Afghanistan at the time. All this ended suddenly while Zahir Shah was, for medical reasons, visiting Rome in Italy. There was a peaceful palace coup by his own cousin, by his own brother-in-law, who was married to the king's sister, Muhammad Dawood Khan, or for short, Dawood Khan, who actually seized power, changed the government, and established a republic. He abolished monarchy. And I have to tell you, after that, Afghanistan has never been the same. It changed rapidly. In 1978, in April of 1978, something that should have never happened, happened. And that was a Marxist takeover in Afghanistan. I have to say, without giving any opinion about Marxism, is the first time the Soviet leaders talked to the leadership of the Afghan People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, they thought they were nuts. Brezhnev one time in an interview said, I asked President Taraki, the first Marxist president of Afghanistan, after they had seized power, they had killed President Dawood, they had killed members of the family, and the rest fled. I asked him, what do you want to do with a society which is still tribal in the south, very economically backward in the center and the north? And Taraki said, we'll be arriving at socialism next year. I said, when I heard that, I told him, Soviet Union is not fully socialist. After decades, how can you arrive at socialism? He said, don't worry, just watch us. So what did they do? They introduced modern education. They unveiled women by force. They distributed land among peasants. And everything they did backfired on them immediately. And as soon as they imposed their radical reforms on Afghanistan, that is criticizing Zahir Shah and Mohammad Dawood Khan for being slow in modernizing Afghanistan. Modernization should take place in a rapid fashion. It backfired. It created a mass movement against the Marxist government, and it forced the Soviet Union in actually Christmas Eve, 1979, to invade Afghanistan, to maintain the Marxist regime, and to somehow keep Afghanistan under the umbrella of the Soviet Union. And of course, in the process, they only ignited a much wider resistance among the more traditional sectors of the society. Now the fight was against the godless atheist communists from Soviet Union. Now Afghanistan might be very divided, ethnically, linguistically, regionally, but Afghans have one character. When foreigners invade their country, they become the most unified people in the world. And the thing that unifies them is their religion, right? This Islam is the flag of not a religion per se, but a political ideology that can bring them together. And of course, Afghans showed the Russians, you don't only have the 1812 Napoleonic invasion. We also have a little bit of trap for you. There is a lot of snow here, and there's quite a bit of rugged nature here, and your tanks are useless in this kind of environment. Very rugged, very cold, and of course, not to mention the fact that the Mujahideen, as they were called, Mujahid, for those of you who are interested, is the word for a person who fights in the name of Islam. A person who is a warrior of Islam. Mujahideen, the plural, warriors of Islam. Bands of Mujahideen began to arm themselves and attack Soviet soldiers and officers, but that would not have succeeded without the United States. The Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, was exclusively responsible for igniting a war against the Soviet Red Army. I heard it myself with my own ears, that the plan in Washington was to convert Afghanistan into Soviet Union's Vietnam. That is, they made us bleed in Vietnam. Now we will make them bleed in Afghanistan. So, arms were distributed. Once the United States got involved, how do you get arms into Afghanistan? The closest ally the United States had in the region was Pakistan to the south. Pakistan became involved. The Pakistani military got involved. The Pakistani ISI, military intelligence, became involved. I don't know how many of you remember that beautiful face of the dictator Zia-ul Haq, who was our closest ally, because he was constantly going back and forth, providing basically all the armaments and spare parts to the Afghan Mujahideen. And Iran became involved. Saudi Arabia, with a lot of money, became involved. The result was that this movement became a popular movement, very well funded and very well armed, and they began to inflict major defeats on the Soviet Red Army. I would say that the defeat of Soviet Union and the collapse began many years before in Afghanistan, as the Soviet Red Army showed that it could not even deal with Afghanistan, a rugged, quote-unquote, backward country. And of course, in the midst of this, a group of Arabs began to arrive in Afghanistan to wage their jihad or holy war against the godless Soviets, led by Osama bin Laden, the millionaire Saudi whose father, we think that he had somewhere around $180 million in his bank accounts. And of course, I still cannot figure out how many children there are in that family, because the mothers are showing, they're like 50-some wives, so I've given up, basically. But Osama bin Laden came to wage his jihad brought his Saudi money. And of course, they were joined by another very interesting and disturbing character, Ayman al-Zawahiri. Ayman al-Zawahiri was the brain behind the Islamic Jihad movement. Remember those people who assassinated President Anwar Sadat in Egypt? This guy was a member of that group. He went to jail for 3 years. He was released. He also went to Afghanistan to wage his holy war. It was in Afghanistan that the two met and the two created Al-Qaeda, the base. Al-Qaeda is the word for the base. They actually trained their fighters fighting Soviet soldiers and officers. And of course, today, as we constantly tell our public, oh, Al-Qaeda is gone, Al-Qaeda is destroyed, Osama bin Laden has been killed. Show me a news item which says Ayman al-Zawahiri has been killed. He's still there. Al-Qaeda is still there. To those who say Al-Qaeda is dead and gone, shame on you for putting the American people to sleep, basically, because Ayman al-Zawahiri is alive. Al-Qaeda is alive. Al-Qaeda has training camps in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda has training camps in Pakistan. Osama bin Laden himself lived in a very beautiful building, provided courtesy of Pakistani military intelligence. Pakistani military intelligence makes sure that these organizations survive for the day they need them, with allies like this who need enemies. At any rate, the result of this war, 10 years, over 2 million Afghans were killed. 2 million people were killed during the Soviet occupation. Several million became refugees. The largest group in Pakistan, another major group in Iran, they lived in refugee camps. It is from these refugee camps that the Soviet Red Army, after leaving, that Taliban began to emerge. What happened? You have children who have become homeless, who have become parentless, who have been forced to flee their country. Where do they go? To refugee camps. Many of them to Pakistan. Pakistan created refugee camps, but they did two things. They provided these boys with military training. They also fed them. They also, thanks to money from Saudi Arabia, where does that money come from? From sale of Saudi oil to US oil companies. This is all dollars, right? Working their way into Pakistan and Afghanistan. They actually created an army. Talib, T-A-L-I-B, means a student of religion. Taliban with I-A-N are religious students. Last time I saw religious students with anti-tank technology, I don't know when it was. This kind of technology was provided to them by the CIA, by Pakistan, by Pakistani military intelligence originally. So we are dealing with an organization which was basically created as a mercenary army for the Pakistani military intelligence to operate inside Afghanistan. And by 1996, having allied themselves with the Arabs who had come in Al-Qaeda, they seized power and they immediately showed their real face, what their ideology is. Their ideology, first and foremost, is anti-woman. This is foundational to their ideology. In some ways, I have said it. If you go ever to an Afghan household, right, the first thing Afghan children do, they go and kiss the hands of their mothers or fathers, or both, in fact, and they are kissed on both sides of the face, right? So how can Afghans behave this way toward women? It's because they're not Afghans. They were 4 years old, they were 5 years old. They had no family, they had no mother, they had no father, they had no Afghan culture. They were ruthless and ruthless at the same time. They were brought up in Wahhabi schools, training them, indoctrinating them by Saudi madrasas or religious schools, in which from sunrise to sunset, you had to recite various verses from the Quran without knowing what you were reciting, because that's in Arabic and they knew Pashto or Persian, right? They were brainwashed to become professional killers. And the people of Afghanistan are an alien people to these folks. So they imposed the burqa, or burghe as it's called. That is head to toe coverage. They also began to execute women in soccer stadiums to unleash a reign of terror on the Afghan people. And of course, let us not forget, they expand, as Bob talked about World Bank and so on and so forth. They have an economy. Their economy is based on production of opium. And when they realized they have the capability of converting opium to heroin, they actually got involved in production of more advanced drugs, right? Afghanistan today exports 90% of the world's opium and heroin to the rest of the world. And in 1 year, in the beginning of their arrival, we have Taliban producing $200 million worth of heroin and opium. Now it must be in billions. United States never managed to contain that. United States never managed to destroy it. Laser bomb attacks on poppy fields can destroy a few here and there. They knew how to operate under even the guns and the Air Force of United States, and they are back reproducing their old economy. They also waged an attack on Afghan civilization. These are the remnants of ancient Afghanistan. These are the magnificent statues of Buddha, because this was, for a long time, a Buddhist country in Bamiyan in central Afghanistan. And what did they do? They exploded the statues of Buddha. And the result of all this was that there was a resistance movement against them formed in the northern Afghanistan. The Lion of Panjshir, Panjshir is a region in northern Afghanistan, the Persian Tajik legendary commander Ahmad Shah Massoud was basically the head of this northern alliance. He is the one who, sitting in Paris in a conference with the European Union, told the West, this is just the beginning. You will see them export their terrorism to the rest of the world. Watch out, either help us or they will come in your way. But at the time, I have to tell you, a lot of people laughed at him. You know why? Because US oil companies were negotiating with Taliban in Houston for building oil pipelines connecting Central Asian oil and gas to Pakistan for export to the rest of the world. We ignored it. 2 days before 9/11 attacks, Ahmad Shah Massoud was assassinated by Al-Qaeda. You know what they did? They asked for an interview with him. They placed bombs in the recorder. They were supposedly journalists. They placed the bomb in the recorder and said, we're going to record your voice. And as the interview started, it just exploded. It was suicide bombing. 9/11 did not start in New York. 9/11 did not start in Washington. 9/11 did not start in Pennsylvania. It started in northern Afghanistan 48 hours before. That was the beginning of the attack. They hit the main opposition inside Afghanistan, the Tajik Persian opposition. And then 48 hours later, this, and how can we forget it? It's coming on Saturday. And whose flag is waving on top of Kabul? The flag of the same people who organized the attack. It was with help from Northern Alliance. We provided them with air cover. They provided us with land cover, that they took Kabul from the Taliban, and they forced the Al-Qaeda to flee into the mountains of southern Afghanistan and then Pakistan. And of course, a NATO occupation began, which ended just now. NATO divided Afghanistan into various military zones. You see the Americans, the French, and the British taking all the tough places, and somehow, some ways, the Italians always choose the best place in the country. Look at the Italian flag. They're in Herat. You know why? It's a party town. And because there was no terrorism. And of course, some others, Germans also in the north, there was nothing happening. But they were helping us, supposedly. The real fight was in the south. Taliban is Pashto. Taliban is tribal. They are in the south. They are receiving aid from inside Pakistan. And we chose from the very beginning the most corrupt person we could choose, Mr. Karzai. You know why? Because the British liked him. He had worked for the British Petroleum, British banking, and so on and so on. And of course, again, going back to the story, Afghanistan yesterday, today, and tomorrow, we had no idea who to go to. So we went to London, and of course they know who should rule Afghanistan. This guy, since he came to power, he and his family has stashed hundreds of millions of dollars in their bank accounts. And when that was done, we brought a person, believe it or not, more corrupt, more inept, more incompetent than the previous one, which is Mr. Ashraf Ghani, who's actually a Pashtun, again from the south, from the same tribe, the Al-Zaid tribe that Taliban comes from. We thought we had staged a coup. We had brought somebody who in language, culture, geographical region also comes from the same region. Ashraf Ghani also, we loved him. You know why? Because he was educated in this country. He was actually bipartisan support for him. He would go, he would get a check, Mitch McConnell and the senator from New York, Mr. Schumer, right? This is the good old days, Ghani, when he gave interview on NPR. And of course, he was a professor of anthropology. I wish he had stayed as a professor of anthropology. But of course, Johns Hopkins produced this guy. By the way, Johns Hopkins also produced, I think, Blinken. And of course, Jake Sullivan. Johns Hopkins has to do something about this graduate program. It's not producing the best people. Whatever the case may be, the situation was falling apart. When in July, President Biden announced, and we come to the present to conclude, President Biden declared on the eve of 4th of July that we are moving out. The announcement had been made earlier, but then for the first time the media asked, don't you think it's unavoidable that things will fall apart in Afghanistan? And one answer, which really irritated me, I have to admit, I'm not here as a Republican or Democrat, I'm here as an analyst and a historian. But when somebody says, I want to talk about happy things, that worries me. And especially when he adds man in the end. That's just bothersome. What is going to happen to Afghanistan? Don't worry about it. Why? Because we have a 300,000 man army and it cannot be defeated by 75,000 Taliban. With one minor issue here, President, and that is the fact that they were an army which actually fought with air cover from United States. That air cover made everything possible for the Afghan army. And why insist on August 31st? Why, I believe, now in retrospect, the political advisors, and this is a problem, when you listen only and only to political advisors, rather than to your intelligence, rather than to the Department of Defense, rather than to CIA, you actually listen to your political advisors who say, if we have everybody out by 9/11, we can have an anniversary. Easy event, let's celebrate it, and it's going to be an easy withdrawal. Yeah, let's just get out before 9/11, so I can declare that I am the one who ended the Afghan war. I think there was bipartisan consensus that we should get out. The negotiations for withdrawal had started with President Trump, but President Trump had imposed severe conditions that we will not withdraw unless you stay put and you are not going to attack, you're not going to hit our folks, and so on and so forth. Whatever the case may be, that withdrawal was set for May. President Biden delayed it to August, and the withdrawal began. And I have to tell you, the execution of that withdrawal was a disgrace. Unplanned, undisgraced, and of course, now we have Taliban sitting in Kabul. Repeatedly, the statement has been made, the buck stops with me. But of course, the first group to be blamed was the Afghan armed forces. that they didn't fight, it's not our problem, and so on and so forth. Let me remind you that something happened, and that something is an army which lost nearly 70,000 soldiers and officers fighting Taliban and fighting Al-Qaeda is not an army of cowards. They fought heroically, they fought bravely. And you look at the numbers, I don't have to go over them. You have 50,000 civilians, almost 47-some thousand civilians dead. These are people who fought the Taliban. These are the people who fought Al-Qaeda. The reason for that Afghan army was that no air support was provided, first, and of course, when the equipments, those equipments, the multi-billion-dollar army we left behind for Taliban, when the opposition and other armed groups asked for some help, we said, no, we are leaving that all with the Afghan army. And the result was, after so many years, trillions of dollars of spending, what we have today is a disaster. Execution matters, even when it is a withdrawal that you have decided to do it on a hurry. And of course, it still remains a mystery to me. You have the Bagram Air Base, the best well-protected place. Those who have been in Afghanistan know it's 20 miles north of Kabul, well-protected, several landing areas, so on and so on. That was abandoned. And instead we went to a civilian airport in Kabul to leave Afghanistan. It still doesn't make any sense. And of course, next to that issue was that the withdrawal takes place at 3 in the morning. The Afghans get up, say, US forces are gone. What happened? You can imagine what kind of panic it caused. And next to it is this Polecharki prison, which is close to Bagram Airport. It has several thousand terrorists, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, ISIS, in that prison, right? And we left it. You know, Afghans will take care of it. Well, immediately the prison was broken and the Taliban came in and they released thousands of terrorists to the world. Today, Afghanistan is once again the base for Al-Qaeda, for Taliban itself, of course, and ISIS. And that's why you have this kind of panic. People running on the runway, trying to hang on to the planes. A panic-stricken people who know there is no support left on the ground for them. And how can we forget the scenes of human beings falling off the planes? So many people have made comparisons with Saigon in 1975. You know, the helicopter landing on the roof of the US Embassy in Vietnam. But I have to say this, there is a fundamental difference. Vietnam has been fighting for its true independence, for its unification. Then they fought the Americans and so on and so forth. After Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong won, nobody expected the Vietnamese to send any terrorists to the United States, right? Vietnam had a nationalist sort of agenda, nationalist Marxist agenda. But Afghanistan, Taliban does not look at Afghanistan as its nation. Taliban looks at Afghanistan as a base for perpetuating and advocating terrorist organizations and terrorist activities. In the process, of course, let us remember the tragic death of 13 very brave US soldiers and officers and 157 Afghans who were the first victim as power transitioned from the US-backed government of Ghani to the Taliban and its allies. These are human beings, ladies and gentlemen, and they will be the victims of a terrorist state. It's actually, should I call it what I think, it's a super terrorist state. It just established itself with wanted terrorists in place. And I have to say just a few words as we wrap up, that I am absolutely, absolutely appalled by the US media and the way it has taken care of. I know media is a low wall, and It has been under attack left and right. But come on, man, as our president says. You know, is this how you cover? Nobody really took the time to go to Afghanistan to see how Taliban was expanding. No one was really looking at the situation as it unfolded. They were forced to show those scenes of people running on the runway and so on and so forth. And then they stayed for a few weeks, and now they are trying to turn the page. Oh, it's something that happened, and it will be forgotten. I hope that Afghanistan will not be forgotten. Last time we forgot Afghanistan in 1990s, we forgot it at our own cost. And what happened as a result was 9/11. Today, with thousands of terrorists running around, with the terrorist state seizing power in Kabul, expect them coming first to Russia, then coming to Europe, then of course to United States. And I am not trying to be alarmist, but the fact of the matter is Afghanistan is a failed state, economically, financially. No one will invest in it. Bob mentioned some of the reasons why. I can only add to it the fact that lack of legal system, a very, very high level of violence and insecurity and anarchy. Yeah, China will get in. China declares this as their own victory. Pakistan is already helping the Taliban destroy any opposition to the Taliban government. This is a very, very bleak situation. And I can only tell you that I'm very pessimistic, and I am grief-stricken by what has happened to the beautiful people of Afghanistan. Thank you very much. I will take any questions, and there is a microphone, or you can raise your hands, and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions.